Hello, welcome back. In this part, we will make our player move and also look around using keyboard and mouse input. As we have discussed in previous lecture, let us create the character base and the play character classes to begin writing our first feature of project player movement. To begin, firstly create a character class named SM character base, which is the parent character class, and place it in its own folder named character in public class type and click create class. Once the file is created, Unreal prompts for edit, click on no, and in Visual Studio prompt click reload all to see the newly added files. I would like to delete and clean up all the default comment lines in header and CPP files as it is disturbing for me, and hit Ctrl S and Ctrl B to save and build and compile the code. Once the code is compiled, I'm going to open Unreal Editor and navigate into C++ classes folder, then project name folder, then public and character to find my character base class. To create a child class which is inherited from character base class, let's name this class as SM player character and leave the directory as is. I am going to repeat the same thing on the prompts and clean up the default comments, and I'm going to save and build the project. Before we start coding, let us understand the flow of input handling of enhanced input system. Primarily, we have three steps in the process of handling player input. Firstly, to handle player input, we need the reference to player controller. We have discussed basic introduction to player controller in previous lecture. Go ahead and watch it if you haven't watched yet. Now, first step is to get reference to our player controller and validate it to make sure it is valid. Then, we create a data asset class to store our input actions. Data asset is a way to store data separately from code, allowing you to define and organize game data in a modular way. It's a simple container for storing information like variables, configuration settings, or properties that can be reused across different parts of the game. Lastly, we bind the input action to callback function using enhanced input component. Now, we need to override setup player input component method under protected specifier. This method is Unreal's default method used to set up player input component. In this method, we start by getting the player controller from the controller and validate it. Then, we need to get and validate the input subsystem. We can find the header include either in Google or use Visual Studio shortcut Ctrl+T and search the class we would like to use and open the CPP file of that class and copy the header file location from the first line of the file. Here, we use getSubsystem method from uLocalPlayer. Subsystem method takes in a parameter of local player, which we can get from player controller using getLocalPlayer method. To add input mapping context, we need to create one. Let's head back to header file and under public section define a new pointer variable uInput mapping context and name it default input mapping context. We need to access this variable in Unreal Editor, so mark this variable as uProperty. We only want to edit in class blueprint, so keep edit defaults only with a category input subfolder of custom folder. We do not want to include any header includes in the header file rather than the default. So let's forward declare uInput mapping context class. Now, add the default mapping context to subsystem using add mapping context method with a priority of 0. Next, we cast the uEnhanced input component from player input component, which we get as an argument in setup player input component method. If the cast is successful, we need to bind the action. Enhanced input component is undefined at this point. We need to include the header file. We can find it by searching using Visual Studio shortcut Ctrl+T and paste the class we want to search for. Let's comment out binding for now as we want to compile the project. Once the compilation is successful, head back to Unreal Engine and create a new class. Click all classes at top and search for data asset. Click next and name the class as DA underscore input collection and place it in its own folder named data asset and subfolder input and create the class. Make sure there are no spaces in the class name or the folder names because Unreal might throw errors eventually. You know the drill. Click no on the prompt and click reload all in Visual Studio prompt. Delete and clean up the default comments. Now let's create two input actions in this data asset for move and look, and forward declare the uInputAction class. Mark these variables as uProperty and edit defaults only. Now head back to playCharacter header file and create a new variable for our input collection data asset and name it input collection with the same uProperty macro as above, and forward declare the DA underscore input collection class. Back at playCharacter CPP file, firstly include the input collection data asset to access that class. After including the header file, in the bind action method we need to pass the input action parameter, which we can get from input collection data asset. Trigger event to specify when the callback action is performed, and owning class parameter, which is SMPlayCharacter, we give it as this pointer. And lastly, the callback function, which we haven't created yet. I would like to name this callback function as onMoveInputAction. Now let's head back to header file and under private section create a new void function named onMoveInputAction with the uFunction macro. There has been a small correction in the function definition. We need to add const fInputActionValue reference pointer as a parameter and forward declare the fInputActionValue struct in header file. We have successfully created and bound the input action to the callback function. Now we need to get the input value of type vector2d and store it in a local variable. We use vector2d as input value for movement because we only need two values, forward and sidewards, as x and y axis. Now let's check if the input value is not 0 and print the x and y input values on screen to see if it's working. Here we use the custom debug print function we wrote at the beginning of this series. To use that namespace, we need to include smdebug helper header file. We need to repeat the same thing for y value as well. Check if value is not 0 and print the value. Now we have finished the coding part of this lecture. I'm going to hit save and build the project. Now, to make movement system work, we need to do a few things. Firstly, create a blueprint of input collection data asset. Then, get input actions and input context from third-person template. And lastly, create blueprint of player and assign data asset and input context. Now, I'm going to create a folder in my content folder named blueprints and a data folder inside that and another folder named input for input related assets. I'm going to create a data asset of type DA underscore input collection. I'm going to create an input folder outside the blueprints folder and move the input actions and input context from third-person template to our input folder. Now we need to assign the input actions in data asset to bind the action. Lastly, let's create a folder named character and player subfolder, and in player folder create a blueprint of SMPlayCharacter. In playCharacter, assign the created input collection and input mapping context. Make sure to override the default pawn class in the game mode to be a SM player character blueprint. Now, if you have followed the lecture correctly, on play and when press WASD, you should see the debug messages on screen showing the input values. In the next lecture, we'll make the player actually move using the input values. For any doubts, issues or queries, I'm always available on the Discord. The link is in the description. Thank you for watching. See you in the next part.